So I'd love to start by introducing this morning's first speaker to help us finish the last day, the last and third and final day of the Cambridge experience at home. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Mercer. Sarah is a professor of foreign language teaching at the University of Graz in Austria, where she's head of ELT methodology. Her research interests include all aspects of the psychology surrounding the foreign language learning experience, focusing in particular on self-concept, language teacher well-being, and positive psychology. She's the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books in this area. She also works on the editorial board of various journals, was co-editor of the journal System for several years, is currently the vice president of the International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning, and has served as a consultant on several international education projects. In 2018, she was awarded the Robert C. Gardner Award for Excellence in Second Language Research by the International Association of Language and Social Psychology. An impressive CV. And with that, Sarah, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Eric, for that kind introduction. It's lovely to be here. I can't believe the time it is for some of you guys, and you're up in the middle of the night, and some of you are up very late at night or early morning. It's great to be here and lovely to see you. Thank you for coming along. Okay, let me find my buttons and off we go. Takes a little while to just get it to sync up. Okay, I'm going to let you read this lovely poem that I've discovered that I think is just gorgeous. I will teach you in a room. I will teach you now on Zoom. I will teach you in your house. I will teach you with a mouse. I will teach you here and there. I will teach you because I care. So just do your very best and do not worry about the rest. I love Dr. Seuss at the best of times, but this is lovely. And one of the things, the reason I put this up right at the very beginning for us all is that we're being very kind to students and saying, look, do the best you can. Please don't worry about it. We know that this is a very difficult time for everybody. There's a lot of adjustment and change. Well, I want to say the same to you as teachers. Please don't stress yourself about all the things you could and should be doing. Do the best you can and try to enjoy some of these new experiences and don't worry about the rest. So try and keep a sense of perspective is what I wanted to say. Obviously, sorry, I have to have a little commercial break here. I'm talking a little bit, what I'm talking about today is fundamentally based on the book that I wrote together with Zoltan Dernier. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go along through today's session. So let me begin by explaining to you what is meant by engagement. Engagement is defined as active participation and involvement in learning activities. Now, I know that many of you are very familiar with the notion of motivation, and this is a little bit different, is that we see that motivation is kind of the precursor, what you need to be willing to engage, you need to be motivated, but you can get distracted by all kinds of things, and engagement is about being actively involved in the tasks you want people to do. And there's a little bit of a qualitative difference between motivation and engagement. I'm going to talk through some of that today in the session. I also want to talk a little bit just now about the difference with authentic engagement and just explain why that's important. When you're engaged, when a learner is engaged in their learning, then they are motivationally engaged, they're cognitively engaged, which means they're thinking about their learning. They're effectively engaged, which means that they're emotionally invested and involved in their learning, and they're active. So they're actually doing the task, they're actually behaving, and they're on task. It is not going through the motions, and it's not compliance. So that's quite important to understand in education, that if a learner is just doing what they have to do because they have to do it, that can be a start for engagement, and you can develop that into deeper engagement, but that's not what's meant by engagement. Engagement is getting people actively engaged on all these levels and really invested in what they're doing. And you can imagine, all of you are educators, that's not easy, but we're going to have a little think about some of the things we know about how engagement works. So, hold on, I'm just going to have to move my chat box a little bit because it's a little bit in my way. So engagement is sometimes defined as the holy grail of learning. And the reason it's so important is it's to do with attention and noticing. If learners are not paying attention to what they're doing, if they're not invested and engaged in it, they're not learning. So quite simply, if I move my mouse, it goes away from there. If they're not engaged, they're not learning, quite simply. So engagement is the key to learning fundamentally, that if learners are not actually engaging with the task, they're not learning. It's quite straightforward relationship in that sense. You must be engaged in order to be learning anything. Now, the book that we put together is kind of interesting in that we decided to try and design the book to be relevant to an audience all over the world, so that it wasn't just for particular types of teachers and particular types of setting. So what we decided to do is we split it into what we call principles and actions. And we took 31 principles that we organized throughout the book, and within that there's 25 action points. And the idea is that the principles are supposed to be open and apply to any context. They're based on psychology, they're based on what we understand about engagement. And the idea is that we look at these principles and say, right, this is what we know about how people learn and how people get engaged. And then we've suggested some action points where we said, and this is how you could translate that, that's what you could do. But we were very careful not to want to prescribe to teachers how to do it. You guys know your teaching context better than anybody. You know much better than I do what your situation is, what your learners need, and your context. So what the book can do is say, look, these are some principles. This is what we know about psychology. This is what we know about how people are getting engaged, what factors play a role here. And these are, we've put some suggestions of how you can translate that, but it's the principles that matter. And so you can imagine that essentially these principles still apply in the context we find ourselves now, all of them. So some of the action points are not so easy to translate, but many of the principles are still just as valid when we're in the online learning context as they are in the face-to-face context. And so those are the ones I've had to pick through in a jumble. So I have to admit, they're not sort of neatly organized, but you'll see. And I've picked ones that I think are still relevant. I don't think I'm telling many of you anything massively new, but maybe it's helpful to just kind of be reminded of things that you know and that these are still relevant now. And maybe this is important to also say, you haven't lost your skills as a teacher. Please don't doubt yourself about what you know you can do. You were a great teacher before, you're a great teacher now. Make sure that you find the transfer points, that you bring in some of those things that you have used in your regular teaching life, and you can bring them in here and use them here as well. Okay, let's have a look in the chat box. Everybody's here from all over the world. It's fantastic to see so many people here. Tell me a little bit online so I can just get a quick feel for what's your context like now. Are you doing asynchronous teaching, synchronous teaching? Do you have any face-to-face? Is there any teaching at all? Tell me a little bit in the chat box about your situation, just so I can have a little look. Online, no face-to-face, asynchronous, WebEx face-to-face, both, bit of a mix, Zoom and Teams, both, only online teaching, live classes, synchronous and asynchronous, school in person and online, recorded videos, synchronous and asynchronous, teaching on Meet, all on Google Meet, Zoom, live classes, both, no teaching at all, oh dear. I also train a face-to-face video, synchronous, only online, creating videos, right. So the real mixture, and that doesn't really surprise me. Also in the setting that I work in, we've had a real jumble of different types of asynchronous and synchronous formats, depending on what the kind of tools that are available. I just want to talk a little bit just about some of the general conditions, just to remind you, not that you need reminding, I'm sure, but in this global pandemic and lockdown, something that we don't really talk about is the massive emotional strain and trauma that the learners and staff, teachers, are feeling at the moment. Everybody's feeling it. There's nothing normal about this situation and this global pandemic and what we're going through at the moment. So that does affect our ability to concentrate, it affects our ability to interact, it affects our ability to sustain the amount of time we spend on task. One of the strange things we've kind of done in education is we've kind of tried our best to carry on as normal, but there's nothing normal about this. And I think it's quite important that we recognize that and give ourselves, Mark Brackett uses the phrase, permission to feel, and to recognize that and to accommodate that. Very often people are working on shared access to Wi-Fi and devices in one home. And so sometimes the internet's not very strong, or there's interference, background noise. I know some of you who have commented that there's a little bit of that now. These are just some of the things you have to work with when you're in technology, and it causes a strain. Also, one of my friends' household, they've got 4 kids, and they're all trying to vie for the Wi-Fi at the same time. It is a lot to take on board, and when you're in an online space, you've got not the same information, and that makes it very difficult to concentrate for longer periods of time. If you're working on something, so one of the things that happens in terms of engagement is the notion of flow. So flow refers to when you get so engaged in something that you lose track of time and you get really into it. That is much harder to do in the online space than it is in an offline space. In an offline space, sometimes you can really get into a task. You can get into, for example, your teaching preparation. And that becomes a little bit tricky. There are also equity discrepancies, more so, and they become even more pronounced than in regular classes in terms of access to technology, access to internet, Wi-Fi, data, and those kinds of things. So there's bigger issues in terms of equity discrepancies now. And we're all learning by doing. So I've been sort of finding my feet with digital tools as well. And so I think some of my students are here as well, so they can tell you that I've been making it up as I go along as well. There were things I didn't know. And I'm certainly not here as any kind of expert about digital tools. But this is actually what I think is a nice thing about this is we're all a little bit back to being junior teachers again. And as long as you can be kind to yourself, I find that students are extremely forgiving of digital cock-ups, because that's life and you're learning and you're trying your best, and learners appreciate that, and so do other teachers. So the reason I'm saying all of this is that at the moment, less is more. Be kind to yourself. Your learners also need a little bit of breathing space. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that, some of the principles today. Please don't go away from today's session thinking, oh my God, I need to do all of these different things. That's not how it should be. Less is more. Pick ones that you think are going to be useful for you. Pick strategies and principles that you can work with and go with those. Okay, the book is based around a model of engagement that has got three sort of main components. You have to first think about, how do we get learners even willing to engage? How do we then trigger that engagement? How do we get them hooked? And how do we keep them there? And so you've got these three parts, and they're not discrete sections, they overlap, but they require you to do different things as a teacher. So the teacher creating a willingness to engage requires slightly different strategies than if you want to trigger that engagement and you want to keep that engagement on the task. So I'm going to talk about those three stages now and the different sort of strategies that we can use. Okay, so let's begin with willingness to engage. I've just chosen three main things to focus on at the moment: a facilitative learner mindset, positive student-teacher rapport, and positive group dynamics. Now, these three things, in my view, are fundamental to willingness to engage in any classroom, and they are fundamental when you're in a regular classroom as well as in an online classroom. And so we have to think about how we can do that in the online space in a way that wouldn't be the same as, would be the same principle but different to the classroom. A facilitative learner mindset refers to the idea, I can do this. The learners need to feel I can cope with this and I can do this. And some of the questions I've been asking my students in the online space, I discovered that they're feeling quite overwhelmed. It requires a lot of them in terms of self-regulation. Some of them have the skills, some of them don't. And it can be very difficult for them to manage all the different deadlines, different tools, different activities they have to do. So we need to try and arrange our teaching very consciously to help learners have that sense of, okay, I can do this, I can cope with this. We need more than anything, and it goes back to the Dr. Seuss poem at the beginning, we need learners to feel that the teacher cares for us and our learning. So there's something called pedagogical caring, which is not just about caring for them as individuals, but actually caring for their learning, that we're invested in wanting them to learn and to make progress. And positive group dynamics refers to the sense that learners feel psychologically safe and feel a sense of belonging in the group. So let's have a look at all of those in turn. So concentrating on it, I can do this. How can we make learners feel this sense of competence in this space? So I think one thing that's really important is making progress visible and breaking down goals. And this is important in any sense, but in the online space, and particularly at the moment where there's so much coming at learners in different ways, they don't have the same structure as getting up and going to school and having classes at regular times. So there's a lot more for them to organize. So breaking down goals means that if you set distal goals, you need to do this by then. Give them midway points, break it down, break it into proximal goals. That helps them to see that they're making progress and makes this big thing easier to manage. So for example, if you have learners have to write a report on something, get them to maybe write one paragraph of it first by then, and we'll look at it and talk about it then. And then maybe get the structure by this point. And so break it down into those kind of pieces where they can manage it. Again, you're going to think about your context and what you're asking learners to do. It's impossible for me to know everybody's setting, but have a think about, is there a way you can make this smaller pieces? It's about this concentration. It's about this being able to make it manageable so that they feel that they can cope more easily. Can we break it down, little bite-sized pieces? Teach them how to learn in this new context. And better still, they can teach each other. And better still, the learners teach me. So I have to admit, a lot of my learning in this last few weeks has been, yes, learning by doing, just sort of finding out and trying stuff and seeing what happens. But also my fantastic learners teach me about tools to use and teach me about ideas of things and ways of doing stuff. We had something the other week and we tried it, and then one of my students said, you know what, Sarah, there's a better way of doing this. And I said, oh, really? What? And she gave me he gave me rather the idea of Jamboards, which is a little bit like Padlet but nicer. So it was great. So teach each other and learn from each other in a partnership. This is a wonderful opportunity to be in that relationship with your learners where you're both learning together. And so talk to them, let them tell you about their ideas, what they've got, how we could do this better. But give them some guidance about how things work. Be patient, and tell them, this is what you touch for this is how you press this is where you save this. They need that little bit more help in organization and management than they perhaps might normally do. And as we normally do, keep the structure, but see where you can build in choice and voice. And keep in this idea where you can give them a little bit more autonomy, where they can choose to do different things, where they've got a structure that's really clear for them to follow so they don't get lost, so they know the deadline, but where they could maybe choose, so they have two options that they could choose from. Even just that small amount of choice can just help motivate them and feel invested and feel that they're doing things about themselves. I see that someone here has commented on learning strategies. So important at the moment, more so than ever. I mean, personally, I think they're very important at any time. But at the moment, this has become very important. And this idea of being able to self-regulate, knowing how to manage your learning, knowing how to set deadlines and goals, keep track of stuff, so important at the moment. My teacher cares about me and my learning. We communicate this through every single thing that we do with our learners, every interaction, every time when we talk with people, every time when we're online with learners. That's how we communicate that. Go beyond the subject learning, so strengthen that personal connection. Give them chance to talk about personal things in their lives. Ask them a little bit. I mean, it kind of happens normally in this space. So, you know, with some of my learners, I've seen their cats and they've introduced me to their cat, or they've shown me a little bit that yesterday somebody had a lovely job. They took their camera and they showed me around their garden. So use that opportunity to connect with learners individually. You may know the, what's it called? Show and tell. So you know where they go and they get an object in their house and they come and they show and they tell the others about it. Or I think it's called go grab and gab is the other way of referring to it. So let them bring in little bits of their personal life. Have that little bit of connection is really important just now. And it's an opportunity for appropriate self-disclosure. Just be yourself. It's okay to be authentically you. And I say appropriate self-disclosure. They don't want to know about the whole of your life probably, but this does change the boundaries a little bit. And learners like to see your home, and I'm sure you're all having a good look around my house as well. And so it's nice for them to be able to see you in your personal space. And you can talk about some of the things you're doing or your garden or a little bit about that. It builds trust. If you share something personal with somebody else, it's a way of building trust and building a relationship. And learners like to be able to do that as well. And use feedback for a little bit of individual chatter. So also when you're doing feedback and you're doing comments when you're giving them feedback on homework, use the opportunity to have a little bit of individual chatter, and use emojis. Emojis are not something I would normally do, I have to confess, in my feedback, but this is a perfect place to do that, to show a little bit of humor and have a little bit of emotions, a little bit of fun and connection. The final thing in this sort of creating that willingness to create is this sort of social emotional climate, this safe space, is feeling safe and belonging in the group together. So helping learners to feel safe in the group together. The 3 R's that we normally have in the classroom, and I'm sure very familiar with this, is rules, roles, and routines. And all of that still kind of applies in an online space. So talking about online netiquette, so the kinds of rules of behavior, how we expect each other to interact and how we expect people to comment and behave. You are very familiar in normal classrooms probably with the idea of building learning contracts, where you say together, okay, We have to think about how we want to work together in the space. What is important for you? What is important for me? And we draw up a little contract. Do that in the same in the online space. Give people particular roles that they're responsible for. So things that a particular learner is responsible for on a particular day. And have some routines. It's quite nice to have routines. We know that with early stage learners that routines help them have a sense of security. And I think in this online space, I think it becomes important again where you say, okay, let's have some routines. It gives structure, it gives familiarity, it builds confidence and comfort. And foster a sense of us. We're going through this together, we're sharing this experience. Draw back on memories and things that happen. Make sure that you make those connections. I saw a really cool idea the other week that someone said they decided in the group to have a, what do they call it, a crazy sock day. I apologize to whoever it is that said this, I didn't know where it came from, but they said have a crazy sock day. So they all came and lifted their legs up and showed each other their crazy socks for the day. So I think that's kind of nice, having this, have a little bit of fun and have some shared experiences together that you feel that you're working together as a group. And maximize collaborative tasks. This is really important to break down the big space group. Obviously, it depends how you're doing that, but if you've got a big space group, you've got, say, 30 learners online, it's very hard for them to want to speak up in that online space. And it's really good to use the breakout rooms for that. And one thing that's joy for me is I find it difficult to get learners to work with other partners in class, but now I can just blame the computer. I just mix up my breakout group again and they're working with somebody else. That's actually quite important. You want them at the beginning maybe to working with friends while they build up confidence, but then it's really nice to mix up the groups because what happens is they become familiar with everybody in the group and it makes them more willing to speak up in front of the whole class then. And having a study buddy or a couple of study buddies, I think this is really important that they have that person outside of class that they can check on each other and they can check on how they're doing and make sure that they've got somebody to buddy together with. And that also gives them a safe space in the class. So essentially, we want them to do all of these things, but I'll let you read this for a second. I still think how you are as a person and how you engage with them on a very human level. I think that social emotional climate in the classroom is absolutely the most important thing. You can have all singing, all dancing, technology and activities, but it's how they connect with each other and how they connect with you that really matters. Okay, so let's use the comment box and see for you, how do you strengthen communication? What do you do to enhance the emotional climate between you and your learners? I'm sure you guys have got much more experience of this than me, so please do share your ideas. What are you doing at the moment to strengthen communication with your learners, amongst your learners, and build a positive emotional climate? Oh, a virtual cafe, that's a lovely idea. Being a bit silly, I think, is a fabulous idea. I think that's great. Oh, showing them around the house, I like that idea. Posting a picture of where you're working, letting them see, cracking jokes, calling them personally, having some kind of personal connection, I think is very important just now, so that they know that they respond. Oh, having a happy birthday Padlet, that's nice. Using polls, looking outside your window so they can see, sharing a little bit about daily lives, using a connector activity. Certainly all things like icebreaker activities, those still stay extremely relevant here. So having things like icebreaker activities, they're usually used at the beginning of a course or the beginning of a session. We can use those all the way through, because one of the things that we use icebreakers for is building up that connection. And I think we need that more than ever. So building in icebreakers repeatedly throughout your teaching weeks, I think is important. Asking about their family, good. Asking about their life at home. Asking them about their interests. Oh, tongue twisters, that's fun. Playing games. Oh, very much, and we'll come back to that later. And showing empathy, I think empathy is probably one of the most important skills. Okay, let's move on and have a little think about triggering the engagement. So the willingness to engage for me is possibly the most important part, is building that social emotional climate where the learners feel safe, where they feel cared for, where they can build up their confidence. And then we go on to look at how we design the actual activities and the tasks. So let's have a little think about triggering engagement. Getting them active. So one of the things that's the key to the definition of engagement is being active. Getting them curious. Thinking a lot about the nature of curiosity. If I could give you one word for triggering engagement, take away the notion of curiosity. Take away thinking about and reflecting on what can I do to make them curious. and foregrounding the relevance of what they're doing. At the moment, they're so overfaced with so many things that it's hard for them sometimes to pick out the importance. So helping them to know what is relevant and what's important would be key. Okay, getting them active. I put something here. The picture's supposed to represent baby feet. And the idea is keep things simple, do less, help them have little steps of success. Less is more. Keep the instructions and the tasks more simple than you need to be. If you're in class, you can do things a little bit more complex. You can stagger things. Sometimes in the online space, that's just altogether too much. And so simplify it, less is more. Keep your instructions and the tasks simple and straightforward, but full of action. Quick starts, using a quiz, a word cloud, polls, any of those kinds of things. Getting something at the beginning that gets them engaged, gets them doing something straight from the word go. So getting them active right from the beginning of the session so that you've already got them kind of hooked, you've got them there already. And get kinesthetic. Oh, I don't know about you. I hope you guys are not going through what I'm doing, but I spend my whole life welded to this chair. I mean, really, I spend hours and hours every day sat in a chair. Now, it's a lovely chair, but still. And I'm sure for learners it's the same. One of my learners the other day said she had 15 hours of online stuff. I mean, that's incredible. So the idea of getting people moving is so important generally. And honestly, if I could make you do anything in your classes, also when you go back to face-to-face teaching, get them stood up, get them moving. If they have to do a role play, get them doing it stood up. So, but kinesthetic is just about building that into the online. We're all sat here, get them up, get them playing Simon Says. Mirroring is where they have to, you can see them on the screen if you've got something like Zoom or Teams or WebEx. And you do, Simon, you do some actions and they have to mirror you. So they have to follow what you're doing. And then you make it quick and you do this and then you do that and then you do this. So all kinds of stuff that they can have a good laugh and they can have a bit of fun with you. Charades, that's a fab idea. So anything a little bit kinesthetic to get them active and get them hooked as well. How am I doing for time? Okay. So get them curious. Have learners predict and ask questions. So one of the things that I've seen a lot of teachers using at the moment is getting them to photograph something close up, you know, so that it kind of distorts it a little bit so that you can't see things very clearly. So close-up photographs, that you use those and have learners predict what is it, can they guess? Maybe different learners take it in turns. Have them be the ones that ask questions of others. Pose questions and puzzles and mysteries yourself. There's some great online games where they can go and find the hidden object and where they can look at different puzzles and mysteries and so on. So using curiosity as a way of getting them to think and be engaged and getting them to want to know more, that's kind of a part of it. And make stuff attractive. So using visuals, using teasers, cliffhangers. And cliffhangers works well also between sessions. So say, okay, I'm going to ask you this question now. Have a little think about it. I'm not going to tell you till the next session, but what do you predict might be the answers? What do you think will be the answer to that question? So using those kinds of links to try and get them thinking and making the connections between sessions. And foregrounding the relevance. I think this is important in all learning. So there's something called expectancy value theory and motivation, excuse me. And this is about when you have an expectancy that you will succeed, then you're motivated, but also you have to value what you're doing. You have to see the worth in it and the point in doing it. And many of you will know that when you've got small kids, one of the first things that when you're about the 2s and 3s, why? It's like the question for everything, why? And that's really very, very telling about human nature. We want to understand the logic of it. We want to understand the why. So make that very explicit with your learners. Don't be afraid to tell your learners, we're going to do this activity and this why it's useful to you. Be very explicit about it. So help them to see the why of tasks. Spell it out why you think this is important, why you think this is worth doing, what we're going to do with this and how they'll benefit from it and learn. And yeah, I think teenagers especially like this right now. And it's very important to keep them engaged at the moment so they can see why they're doing this. Relevance becomes important when they can make that connection to their real lives. So if you can find ways of creating activities, let them find a way of making that connection, making their real life connection so they bring that in. And there is no one size fits all. You know, if teaching was so straightforward, there'd be one remedy, one magic solution for it, it'd work for everybody. But you only have to look at the chat box and see the different situations that people are in to know that There can't possibly be just one way of doing this. And that's for the context as well as for the individual learners. So let them have ideas about how they could do that. Let them bring in some of their own thinking. Say, I want us to do this. This is what I want the outcome to be. Guys, what ideas do you have for doing this? How might we do this a bit differently? Do you have a suggestion how you'd like to adapt that and do it in a way that suits you more than suits just generally? So try and build in that autonomy a little bit. Okay. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the maintaining engagement so I can make it way to my question and answer session on time. So willingness to engage is that social emotional climate. Triggering engagement is getting them curious, getting them active, kind of getting them started, getting them into the activity and seeing them relevant. And maintaining that engagement is keeping it over time so that we keep them there, we keep them on task, however long that task might take. So let's see your prediction talents. What 3 principles do you think I'll highlight for maintaining student engagement? What do you predict are my 3 principles? Let's see what you suggest. What ideas do you think? Variety, yeah, that's a fantastic suggestion. Variety is really important for keeping it up. Curiosity, action, autonomy, short, keeping it simple, challenging them, or great tips. Keeping it attractive, using positive feedback, constructive positive feedback, motivation, I like that, that's very good. Variety, helping time management, showing them that you care, breaking down tasks, making it more manageable. All of these are fantastic ideas. I think you guys should be running this instead of me. I think they're great ideas. Originality, keeping it short, keeping them involved, using humour, novelty, all great ideas for keeping learners engaged. So to maintain engagement, the ones that I've chosen, and like you guys have put here, there's quite a lot of things we could have chosen here. I've chosen these 3 things. Keep them active. Being passive and just listening to somebody is even worse online than it is in the face-to-face setting. Keep them active, keep them engaged. Chunk the lessons. So what I mean by chunking is break it down into kind of bite-sized pieces. One big activity can be a little bit overwhelming in the online space. So break it down into chunks, break it down into sort of separate bits and have fun. I hope you guys have fun as well as your learners. Make sure that you enjoy what you're doing, that you have fun and that the students will pick up on that as well. And at the moment, I think having fun is so important that we don't lose sight of that at the moment because we need that fun. We need a bit of humor and we need to be enjoying ourselves. So keeping them active. Keep up the pace, and that doesn't mean quick, and I know some of you have been commenting how quick I speak. I do apologize, my learners are used to this by now, but I forget, and I talk like this. I'm at the speed at the normal time, I apologize. So when I say keep up the pace, I don't mean talk at my speed, I mean that do less. Keep up active, keep things changing, keep attention spans are very short online, do less, but let them change things, let them keep variety, those kinds of things. So keep up the pace in terms of breaking it up, keeping them active. Make action formats visible. So think about output in diverse media formats. So one of the things that I've learned with my groups, that we work on Zoom, and one of the things that I've noticed is that the chat box is very distracting and quite difficult. And we haven't got a real record of it later in the same way that's very helpful. So we've started, for example, using Padlets as a space where when we're having a discussion, they can put their output in the Padlet space. What's great for me is I can see how they're getting on and some of the things that they talk about. So think about if you're getting them to do things in breakout groups, how do you make the output of that? How do you debrief? How do you make that action visible? And make progress visible. So one of the key things that we know about engagement is seeing your progress. Seeing you make progress over time is really important for feeling confident, for being motivated, and so on. So Moodle allows you to have progress bars. So progress bars in a sense where you can see how much of a task you've completed, or you can use checklists where you create a checklist and learners can tick off when they've done certain things. So making progress somehow visible can keep people on task, helps them to see that they're making progress towards their goals. Chunking the lesson. I've put this in different modes. So plan the lesson in bite-sized pieces, and I've called this mosaic mode. You know that with a mosaic, when you stand back, you see this beautiful picture of what it looks like. You see this overall picture of it can be a landscape scenery, or maybe it's an animal or something, but it's made up of lots of little parts. And I think that's a lovely way to think about online teaching at the moment is we want to keep the coherence of the big space. We want to keep the coherence of the overall lesson, But we use lots of little parts to kind of build that up, to try and keep the pace, to try and keep it simple and not too much, and to make sure that they have this variety to keep them engaged, but allowing people to be able to enjoy activities where they're spending longer on. I've called this refresh mode. It depends how long your online timing is. So we're doing, for example, 45 minutes now, and 45 minutes is quite a long time to listen and to concentrate. It's very long, probably too long. And so refresh mode means that you need to build in these critical brain breaks where people get the chance to think about something else, have a little refresh, maybe do something a little bit kinesthetic, for example. And you will be familiar perhaps with the notion of islands. So islands is where in the classroom, for example, you break down, let's say you've got a group of 30, you have 6 tables of 5, and they have different activities on each table. And they don't have to be done in any particular order, but they're all different activities of roughly the same length of time. You can use that same notion online. You can have learners working with different types of activities. You can have them in an online space where they work on, you have one group working on something else, then they move on to another activity. They can choose the sequence that they do it in. So think a little bit about how you can build in a little bit of that variety, that non-sequential approach to teaching in an online space. It kind of breaks it down. And I've put this as my final point, I guess, is have fun. You know, it's teaching is such a joy, and I don't want us to lose sight of that in this difficult time. I get the most fun out of my teaching sessions. I enjoy my teaching more than anything else at the moment. I want learners to have fun. I want the teacher to have fun. And if we can have that fun together, I think that's the most important thing for keeping learners with us all the way through. I'm saying this very consciously about an experience myself and some of the research I'm doing with some colleagues in different countries. Online teaching is not online admin. It can be overwhelming at the moment, the amount of admin and administration I have to do, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way. Try not to lose sight of the fun part of teaching. It's the reason you became educators in the first place. You became teachers because you love that interaction with learners. You like to help learners benefit. Even if you're doing things asynchronously, you can get a lot of pleasure out of seeing them make progress, seeing them have fun, have a little feedback, exchange with each other. So don't lose sight of the fact that you are teaching online, that you're enjoying that online space. And so you should both have fun. Play some games. Playing games is not necessarily not pedagogical. There are millions of games that have really strong pedagogical bases, particularly vocabulary games. So think about building in some of the games that you can do. Have fun together. And try to, I hope this doesn't sound idealistic, but try to enjoy this alternative space. When we go back to teaching in our classrooms, things will be different. We will have changed, the learners will have changed, things will be different. And we're growing and we're all benefiting from having new experiences. This will make us more empathetic, it will make us more sensitive, it gives us a new range of tools that maybe we were not familiar with before. It doesn't mean everything's going to go online afterwards, or that it should. In fact, I don't believe it should. But it gives us another string to our bow. It gives us more in our palette that we can use for our teaching later. So try to enjoy this, try to see it as a growing experience, and try to balance that against the stress you're feeling. And I'm just going to let you read this. I think this is important for me to suggest, is that you know, we can talk about the principles, and I hope that some of these might be useful for you to reflect on in your particular context. But more than anything, it's about being who you are, having that relationship with your learners. It's not about all that other peripheral things. It's about being the wonderful teacher that I'm quite sure you are. If you've come here, and my God, some of you have come here in the middle of the night, that says everything we need to know about the kind of educator you are. You're committed, you're motivated, you're dedicated, and your learners will benefit, and they will know, and they will see that. Okay, so to summarize, willingness to engage, for me, that's all about the social emotional climate and communication. Triggering engagement is about getting them hooked, getting them active, using visuals, getting them emotionally invested in what they're doing. And maintaining their engagement is keeping up action, maybe breaking things down into little bits that they can do, using that mosaic idea, and having fun, kind of enjoying yourself. Thank you so much. I even left it with my 5 minutes for time for questions, Eric.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was super. And there was a lot of engagement going on in the chat room, in the chat window, so that speaks volumes. We've got a number of questions, and there's a number of clusters. And one way perhaps of structure them is by age as well. So here's a good one. How do we get teenage students to get engaged if they turn off their video and mute themselves? Some teenage students are starting to become passive as they feel isolated. Any ideas around that?
No, I wish I did. I know this is a real problem. And I also see it. I mean, there's a little bit of a balance to be struck here in that I think also sometimes learners do need to not be visible. So I went to a webinar, for example, on one night this week, and I was just tired and I'd had a long day and I'd been visible the whole day. I just wanted to be invisible. And so I switched my camera off, and not because I wasn't actually engaging, I just didn't want to be visible the whole time. So I think there's a little bit of that as well going on at the moment, is that we're so visible and we feel so present and so observed the whole time that there is sometimes a need to step back and be invisible for a while. And I think that feels easier to do in that way, that you might disconnect with your video being off. But making sure that everybody has to comment. I know that this is really, this is a very controversial strategy, but I'm going to say it anyways. Cold call is the idea that you call on people by name in the classroom. So you say, John, what was your thoughts about this? Or Lucy, what's your thoughts? Or Pablo, how do you see this? Now, cold call should never be used as a punishment. It should never be used if it's a right or wrong answer, so they could lose face. So you can't use it in a sense where you ask somebody if the answer could be right or wrong and they might get it wrong. So I know that usually we're asking for volunteers. But if you might decide to say, for example, Anita, tell me a little bit about what your group said about this. How did you feel about that? Anita, tell me your response. Then they have to engage. They have to respond and switch their microphone on. They don't have to necessarily be visible, but they'll have to put their microphone on. So cold call is not without, it needs to be used with a few caveats. And the most important being, don't use it for factual questions, use it for opinion questions where they're not going to lose face, where they could speak in a sense of safety. And definitely using pyramiding. So pyramiding is where if we're going to ask questions of the group, we get them to discuss in breakout groups before we have them with a whole group together.
Super. Okay, thank you. And then sort of, as I say, staying on the age theme, what about very young learners? Your learners who find it difficult to stay seated for any length of time, who have shorter attention spans. What would be an ideal length of the lesson? And do you have any tips and techniques for keeping them engaged over the course of that lesson?
Honestly, I'm not an expert on young learners, so I apologize that my answer for this is fairly feeble in that I don't really know. So I can't tell you the ages for young learners. I don't have the experience. It's more with secondary and adults, so I'm not very good with young learners. But whatever you know from your regular teaching, all of that still applies, just shorter. So all your experiences of teaching young learners, if you're used to teaching young learners, you will know better than anybody their attention span. I would suggest cut it down by at least a third, if not 50%, because it's so much harder online. But certainly we know with young children, anything kinesthetic, anything to do with movement, getting them active, singing, dancing, gesture, mime, those are really effective ways of getting young learners to engage with things.
Super. Thank you. Okay. And we also have a question about synchronous versus asynchronous teaching. What do you see as the relative strengths and weaknesses?
That's a really good question. Actually, I've been really positively surprised with some of the asynchronous things. Now, admittedly, I'm working with adults, so, but I've been really positively surprised how engaged some of my learners have been with some of the activities in the asynchronous form. I think there are some things that work well in asynchronous form. And particular things like writing activities maybe can be done well in groups, but also asynchronously. I think speaking is generally going to be better in a synchronous space. So it depends on the task you've got, the language skill that you want to foreground. But I have to admit my preference is for synchronous, because I can see the learners, I can build up that connection more easily. But I have seen myself that asynchronous also has a lot of potential when it's structured and you ensure that you have a dialogic process. So I think particularly in the asynchronous mode, it doesn't work well if you dump stuff in a space and they respond, and then a week, 2 weeks later you respond. It needs to be much more like a dialogue. It needs to be more dialogic and more communication. So I think it depends on what skill area you wish to foreground. I think the age of your learners, what your teaching aims are. I think both have great potential, but I think that communication, that interaction, that relationship building is really important in both spaces.
Super, thank you. And I think to round things off, a very practical question. You mentioned a tool that was similar to Padlet, but nicer. Could you just repeat which one that was?
Yeah, I'm doing marketing now. It was my student who told me this. It's called Jamboards, and it's offered by Google, and it's really cute.
Super, thank you very much.
Thanks to my student for that, I have to say.
Okay. I think that's all we have time for, but just to highlight to everyone in the audience that Sarah will be joining the Ask Me Anything panel this afternoon. That's at 4 p.m. UK time. So please do join then again. The theme is going back to the classroom, but that will again be an opportunity obviously to ask you, for you to ask the panel a range of questions. So thank you very much again, Sarah. It was a pleasure having you.